want us to be able to get right into the program, so we're going to have our Vice President, Denny Ho, come up, and he is going to give you introduction to the speaker, but he'll also give you a little teaser on some of the other speakers that we have coming up. Denny.
Thank you. Again, thank you for coming. And he's very modest. Recently, the Chamber of Commerce handed out their annual awards. Paul was the Volunteer of the Year for the city of Maricopa. Our treasurer was the Citizen of the Year, Brenda Campbell. And we were fortunate enough to be chosen to be the Nonprofit of the Year for the city of Maricopa. So we really appreciate that. And I should mention that in Maricopa, we have one of their star reporters here. They were the Business of the Year. So. But we are planning to have several speakers. Next month, we have Dr. Barbara, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, Jaquay. Anyway, Barbara has written a book about the sheep industry of Arizona, the history of sheep. And Maricopa, at one time, had a major sheep industry here, along with the cattle, along with some of the nut growing and other things like that. So she's going to be speaking. That will be February 5th. On March 5th, thank you. April 2nd, we're going to have a speaker. One of our own members was a ranger at Scotty's Castle in Death Valley for about 10 years. So she's going to give a presentation on Death Valley and the Scotty's Castle. In May, we're going to have a speaker on the cotton industry. Julie Murphy will be here. So again, we try to cover subjects that are close and that are of interest. We do have a couple of handouts on the table, so please get the handouts for the upcoming speakers so that you can put those on your calendars. But tonight, we're really fortunate. Jody Crago is the museum administrator for Chandler, Arizona. He oversees 3 sites and numerous installations throughout the city of Chandler. He's been at this for 25 years and has focused on small museums and their connections with their communities. He's overseen major expansions of museum collections, including an addition of more than 500,000 images in their, for their area. He has also spearheaded a new museum construction project, which I'm hoping he'll spend just a minute on. Lots of good things are going up there in Chandler. He co-created the online resource of Chandlerpedia, and has quickly become a digital humanities and museum resource for the Chandler area. He's co-founder of the East Valley Cultural Heritage Coalition, and he former president of the Museum Association of Arizona, and recently he has a TechEd Chandler speaker on how every day can connect us to the world around us. So without further ado, Jody, take it away.
Thank you very much. Everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, so we're going to talk about the Japanese internment camp over at the Gila River Indian Reservation. But before I do that, I am going to take a minute and, wrong direction, talk a little bit about our new museum. So Chandler in 1985 discussed the idea that it needed a new modern museum. Yes. Okay, yeah. In 1985, Chandler discussed the idea that they needed a new museum, and then moved the museum into what they called temporary housing in 1987. We began construction last year. So sometimes it takes a little longer than what you hope, but we're getting there. I would be remiss to not mention our partners, Weddell Gilmore, BlackRock Studios, the architects, DLR Group, our engineering group, and then Dancing Construction, who's building our facility. If any of you have been to the museum, our mission is to be an interdisciplinary learning environment where the community comes together to share its stories, preserve its cultural heritage, and experience Chandler as a people and place. We focus on culture, history, art. We think about it as the community written large. We're not just a history museum. We talk about every component about what life is in Chandler. We are a community gathering place, live performances, interactive. We want to be a place where the visitor shapes what you see there, so you get to choose and pick the kinds of exhibits you're going to see there. And we want to have this idea of museum without walls. I could talk a whole night just about that concept because we put our museum throughout the community. But those are the guiding principles to our building. So if any of you are familiar, how many of you have been to the Chandler Museum? I thought so. We used to be downtown in an old building. And then in 2012, that building we tore down and we moved to this facility, the McCullough Price House. This is a 1938 Pueblo Revival house just on the south side of the Chandler Fashion Center. So we are right smack dab around the mall. This is how the building really looks like when you see it, but you probably, if you've driven by the mall, by the Harkins Theater, you may have missed it because it looks low slung, it's hard to see, there's plants and trees all around it. We're going to change that because this is what we're building. It is a 10,000 square foot facility for just exhibitions and programs. So the whole project written large, we're going to renovate the McCullough Price House. So that's 3,300 square feet. We're building the new museum, which is 10,000 square feet, which includes 1,000 square feet of classroom space, actually over 5,000 square feet of exhibition, and then 2,200 square feet of collection storage. In addition, we're designing 10,000 square feet of outdoor programming space, including a covered patio that's being referred to as the living room because it connects the old building to the new building. It's where people gather. And then we're expanding parking, so there's plenty of parking, including buses. So, if you think about that little drawing of the historic house, that's this structure right here, and this is our new building. And here is our covered area for the area in between. It should make quite a difference. Here's what the building will look like if you cut it in half. This is, again, the old McCullough Price House, the historic house, which is on the National Register. We designed the project so that it wouldn't actually physically touch the building, so we don't put the building at risk to become off the National Register. This is the new building if you cut it in half north-south. This is the new building cut in half east-west. Has these nice butterfly-style wings. It'll be actually 30 feet high in one area. And this will be what it'll look like if you're walking up to it from the parking lot with the McCullough Price House on your left. Get a little closer, you can see that shaded area. Actually, this will look a little different because we actually have a public art project that will be part of the shade structure. Chandler sets aside 1% of its budget in any construction project to create public art. And so this is actually going to be an art project called Infinite Wave, and it will light up at night in different colors and things like that. So it'll be nice. And then this is the lobby when you get in. So just to give you a sense, that's the outside again. And we're gonna officially open in December of this year. We haven't put up steel yet, but the pad is poured, and we will have it done one way or the other because our mayor will dedicate it right before he leaves office in January of 2019. So, wait a minute, this is a different exhibit. Yes, that's because we have exhibits like this exhibit that I'm going to talk about, Un-American. One of the things that the museum has been doing has been trying to bring issues that are relevant to today, issues that are thought-provoking, issues that are challenging. And so you'll hear, as we talk about Un-American, why it's sometimes difficult to have conversations about stories like this. But we want to be able to bring in people that just recently moved here, as well as long-term residents, to be able to have conversations. Every year in the new museum, we're going to have a year-long exhibit like Un-American, or in this case, bigger than boxing. This is the story of Zora Foley when he fought Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight title in 1967. This is a significant fight because this is the first fight where a boxer formerly known as Cassius Clay was called Muhammad Ali by his foe, Zora Foley. This was a battle right before Muhammad Ali lost his boxing title because he refused to serve in the Vietnam War because of his religious beliefs. And it couldn't have been set up between two more different people. Zora Foley on one side, Catholic, family man with 8 children, war veteran from the Korean War. On the other side, single, Muhammad Ali, changing his name, changing his religion, seeming somewhat maybe mouthy, if you would. Whereas Zora Foley was a gentleman boxer. He was known as a gentleman boxer. And the other side, Zora Foley, 34, Muhammad Ali, 24. And so we will talk about race, religion, politics. We'll also bring up topics of CTE and brain effect in sports, protest in sports, all sorts of difficult and challenging and interesting topics. So we'll have this exhibit including plenty of programming throughout the entire thing, and maybe even a boxing class or two if you wanted to come up and learn how to box. So that's coming up. But to show you the width and breadth, I said we're do culture, history, and art. The other exhibit that we're going to do is awkward family photos. So if you are a fan of the internet sensation, awkward family photos, we're going to actually bring that exhibit to Chandler to enjoy. I'm sure all of you, somewhere deep in the throes of your photo albums, or maybe deep in your phone, you have a very awkward photo of you, your family, whatever. Something that seemed like a good idea when you took the picture, and then afterwards, not so good. What does this have to do with Chandler? Well, I'd like to point out this young lady on the right-hand side. She is actually considered one of the Hall of Famers of awkward family photos. She goes by the title Lord of the Rings, if you might be able to see why. Believe it or not, that young lady is now 26, and she works for me as our customer service representative. So she is a Chandler native, and she is famous in awkward family photos. So you can come see her. We'll actually be wearing shirts when she's there, so you'll be able to see who she is, and we'll have a big picture of her. And she's a good sport, but please come and see that. That'll be when we open too. So November, December, January, you'll be able to see that exhibit as well. So without further ado, let's get a little more serious and talk about Un-American, Japanese internment in our backyard. So the museum in Chandler, we've been researching this for a very long time because Chandler was greatly affected by the Japanese internment camp. But as we really sat down to talk about this, and the thing that we wanted to actually delve into is how on earth does this happen in the United States? How does about 120,000 people, over 70% of them American citizens, get incarcerated by our government in a time of war? And for what reason? So this was the driving force behind our question and why we wanted to talk about this idea. And what it really comes down to is at the core of it is a long history of racism and fear of Asians. It really starts originally with the Chinese immigration in the early 1840s when they're coming to build the railroads and out west. But it really picks up once Japanese immigration, because Japanese immigration began in 1885. Now, why did Japanese immigration start in 1885? Well, that's because in 1884, we closed our borders to the Chinese because they were such a high population that Westerners were afraid they were going to take over the culture. And so the federal government closed our borders to the Chinese, but we still needed workers. And we weren't getting enough from the East, so they sought out Japanese. They thought, well, they're different than the Chinese. They're not the same. They're a different country. And really, they primarily came to Hawaii and the West Coast doing jobs like plantation work, farmers, fishermen, railroads, and mill workers. That's where they primarily began working. But very quickly, that population rose to over 100,000 in the West, and people began to become very concerned because, again, we had a rising population that doesn't look like us, doesn't seem like us, whoever us is, if you're an American, I would say, at that time. The biggest issue was that they felt they wouldn't assimilate because, one, they thought of them as non-Christian, two, they thought of them as lacking basic morality, and they thought they were detrimental to American society because they were convinced they were working and sending all of their money back to the home country, but they had no desire to become citizens, and they were just trying to take jobs from American workers. Sound a little familiar? And so, yes, you began to see protests from people like the Grange, AFL, Golden, California, some other groups that were actually veterans groups and others started to protest and ask for the government to do something about this rise in population. At the same time, there was a cultural conversation about the Asian or yellow peril, as it began to be known. There was a sociologist in Stanford, of all places, that wrote a book called The Yellow Peril. And he talked about that there was this nefarious and deviant Asian hordes that were coming to take over our culture. They were going to destroy what it meant to be American. They weren't interested. And yes, they were going to send wave upon wave upon wave of people to, in essence, outbreed us. And that was what stood for intellectual conversation in Stanford at this time.
That's what we did to the Indians.
Exactly. And so there were some political maneuvers to limit immigration. The first is the 1907-1908 Gentlemen's Agreement. So, as this fear of Asians grew, unfortunately, some bad actions occurred on the streets. People started to get beat up. Students were afraid to go to school because there was bullying and worse, violence. And it got so bad that the federal government began negotiations with the Empire of Japan, if you would, the country of Japan, and said, you know what, we're not going to close our borders, but if you agree not to send any more immigrants our way, we will make sure that the military and the police are strong enough to prevent any more violence against your citizens that are living in our country. And so they came to what was known as a gentleman's agreement. There would be no more immigration from Japan, no more approved immigration from Japan, I should say. And there would be a formal effort by the state of California, the military, and the federal government to try to tamp down what was vigilante violence against Japanese folks that were living in the United States. Well, that's pretty bad, because in essence, we're doing the exact same thing that we were doing to China. We were closing our borders because of fear. But it moved forward. In the 1900s and 1910s, several of the Western states started to pass alien land laws. And what that basically said is it doesn't matter whether you bought the land or not, if you were an alien, if you were not a citizen, you could not own your land. And you either had to give it away to somebody, or you had to have somebody that would hold it for you in their name that was a citizen. Now some Japanese had children that had been born in the United States, and so they could pass it off to their children, but many had not. And so that made owning the property, the businesses that they'd already had, difficult to continue. And then finally, in 1924, they passed the Immigration Act, which formally closed all immigration and prevented any immigrants from becoming citizens. Now, what this means is it doesn't matter how long you've lived in the United States, there is no path to citizenship for you. You are just then what's called a resident, not a citizen, but you're not an alien, you just happen to be a resident alien. So you're allowed to live here, but no rights to citizenship, no voting, no land owning, all throughout the United States. So, right now we have the United States fearful of its culture being subdued by these, at the time considered, invading hordes of cultural warriors. In the meantime, there was this other fear that was rising, and this is from some military and some political action that the Empire of Japan was actually taking. And the first is 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan defeated Russia. This was a huge salvo because this is the first time that an Asian country, first time in modern history, I should say, when an Asian country defeated what was considered a European power. And it struck fear into the European and American powers. 1931, the invasion of Manchuria. And with it came violent images and stories of how the Japanese were treating the Chinese that lived in Manchuria. In 1933, Japan formally leaves the League of Nations. The League of Nations, if you remember, was sort of a precursor to the United Nations, where we tried to settle things in, legally, without military arms, created by Woodrow Wilson after World War I. 1933, they officially left, took all their papers, left, no longer part. So if you're a person watching all this, you can start to say, boy, this seems like it's a country that's ramping up, taking more land, taking a militaristic approach. And then finally, in 1937, a formal invasion of China. And with this came what was at the time unparalleled violent imagery. When I was searching for images to put up here, I tried to find the most tame images I could. And yet these images are very upsetting because this was war on a whole new level, war that people that had never been to war could see the violence that was occurring. And this seemed to be racially charged violence. And then one Sunday morning in 1941, the United States found itself under attack. This is a really interesting photo. I don't know if you're familiar with this photo. This was just recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, discovered. This is actually a photo taken by a Japanese Zero as the battle is about to begin. You can actually see the very first bomb hitting. Here's the Zeros flying. You can see all the American ships lined up nice and straight, easy to attack. Obviously, this created all sorts of fear. Fear driven by sort of a psychological fear of race, some political moves that seemed to be like a country that was on the move, and now officially in 41, we're attacked by that country. And so, you really, really see the fear begin to rise. What had formerly been fear of primarily Westerners, primarily along the coast, now became much more rampant to everybody. I don't know if you can see here, but it says, this is December 8th. It says, enemy planes near New York from the Atlantic. Not true. But that's what was the story. You also had this, Philippines are bombed, U.S. is attacked. Some of that was true. Very shortly after this, there was an incident that they thought the Japanese Navy was shelling New York, or shelling LA. They were not, but that's what the fear was. And so that fear was driven by misreporting, rumor, and and some bombs, yes. So, December 8th, the FBI begins to arrest Japanese leaders. These are people that were newspapermen, barbers, I wouldn't call clergy to various religious groups, sometimes teachers. They had a list that the FBI had assumed had created from the U.S. Census, and had used it to then round up several thousand leaders in the West. Here's a description from a child. 1 hour after Pearl Harbor, I was this innocent kid that opens the door, and 2 big white gentlemen would say, "We're the FBI. Where is Mr. Jimmy Rasiku Fuji?" And I said, "Oh, Dad's here somewhere, and I'll get him." And then they took him, and I didn't see him after that for 3.5 years. To me, it was devastating. So that was immediate. Lots of people just whisked away. Families had no idea where those leaders were taken. They were almost all men. And then the newspapers began to ramp up the war hysteria. This fear that there was over 100,000 Japanese descendants, people of Japanese descent in the West, that they were maybe a hidden army that was going to, like a sleeper cell that was going to rise up and attack. The thing that wasn't talked about is 70% of those people were American citizens. The 30% that weren't were the ones that had been barred from a path to citizenship by our political decisions. They weren't people that chose not to. They were, by and large, people that couldn't become citizens even if they wanted to. Many of them had lived here over 30 or 40 years, though. And you started to see ads in the newspapers like this one. Banish the Japs from this coast forever. Mass meeting. How will we rid the coast of the Japs? All sorts of prizes given, encouraging people to come together and share why we needed to get rid of the Japanese. And we had some cartoons that started to show up to, again, start that fear. So if you look at this one, it says, waiting for the signal from home, and it says, honorable fifth column. You see California, Oregon, and Washington. And you see these stereotypical sort of racist views of what a Japanese person would be. That drawing may look a little familiar, and that's because he wasn't writing under the name at the time, but we know him as Dr. Seuss, who was a newspaper cartoonist at the time. There's another one, Know the Japs, that's a several panel cartoon that ran serially in a lot of newspapers, but also was a book that they would hand out for free for people to get. And they have things like, can't pronounce our liquid L's or S's, and they hiss. That they're wide, they have a wide gap between their first toe and their second toe because they wear these things that we would later call flip-flops. But stocky build, sometimes more yellow skin. I mean, really, when you read these cartoons, it's shocking how stereotypical it is presented. But this is part of that culture. This is what's in the people's mind. And yet you have this natural fear. We all remember what we felt like after 9/11, right? But you had all this background of, oh, these people were dangerous leading up to this, and they're taking these military tactics. So that fear is real. Whether their understanding of the Japanese culture or who they were, what they were doing was real or not, that's not the point, but that fear was real. And so, after about a month, the federal government said, you know what, we're going to confiscate radios, cameras, and guns because we do not want Japanese to be spies. And so all up and down the West Coast, you saw Japanese coming in willingly, trading in their radios, their cameras, and their guns. Now, mostly what came? Radio top radios. No long distance, over the sea radios. The cameras, just average, off-the-shelf cameras that most people would have, and the guns, almost exclusively hunting rifles. Nevertheless, they were turned in. And actually, if you look at these photos, many of them look staged. They're not, but they did bring in people to get just the right angle. And then finally, probably the most difficult thing was the federal government, everyone from the White House, Department of Justice, the War Department, governors, and others, started to debate, what should we do? What should we do with this threat? This threat of folks of Japanese descent. And there was a debate among a couple people what we should do. But ultimately, on February 19th, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066, which is what gave the military the authority to begin to incarcerate people of Japanese descent. It actually gave the military the right to arrest or incarcerate anyone from a foreign nation that was fighting us. And so you would say, well, then are we worried about the Italians and the Germans? Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Just over 1,000 Germans were, and less than 1,000 Italians were. For example, baseball player by the name of Joe DiMaggio's parents, not American citizens, Italian immigrants. They were not arrested. So shortly after Executive Order 9066, exclusions orders were nailed up in various neighborhoods throughout California, Oregon, Washington, and the southern part of Arizona. And it was, in essence, saying that they were expected to, dispose of their land, their businesses, their property, show up at assembly centers, and be prepared to be incarcerated. The red area that you see is the official exclusion zone. The people of Japanese descent were not allowed to be living in this area. Originally, it was only a portion of California, but very quickly became the entire area of California. About maybe a third of Washington, maybe a little more than a third of Oregon, and probably about a third of Arizona. The more interesting was the division of the line, and we could have a whole conversation about how they drew the line in Arizona. But the more interesting thing is it followed Southern Avenue, which left certain people on the north side of the streets okay to stay, and people that lived on the south side of the streets not okay and needing to go to camp. This became really important. If you go to Mesa, there are some wonderful oral histories where you hear about families who had women that were pregnant, that they would sneak across so that they would be able to stay in town because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. So basically, these exclusions orders were forced removal. So within weeks, they were informed that they had less than 1 week to close their business, dispose of their homes, land, and belongings, and prepare for an indefinite amount of time to be put into a camp. And as you can see, these photographs are kind of brutal to look at. Evacuation sale, having to leave our business. Thanks for the business. Thanks for the support of all over all the years. Some of these are taken by Dorothea Lange and others of those WPA photographers that we know so well from the Dust Bowl photographs. And all across the streets, you saw this, where people were trying to pack things away, trying to pay to have things stored if they could afford that, or if not, they were selling things, even from their homes. There's lots of stories about that. This one's one of my favorites. Tetsuro Masuda. This photograph is probably one of the better known photographs because he paid to have this sign, "I am an American," on the day after Pearl Harbor, so that his customers would know that he's not a national Japanese, that he is an American citizen. It did not work. Unfortunately, he was forced to sell the store, and he eventually was incarcerated right over here in Gila River. He never got to come back to the store. He was from Oakland. What they were allowed to bring was only what they could carry, typically 2 bags to each person. They were sent to these assembly centers, and these assembly centers were going to be temporary places to house them until they could build actual camps, because we made this executive order, but there were no camps already built to send these people to, so we needed time to build the camps. So they sent them to what were called assembly centers, and you can see here's a young lady waiting to go. Once they got to those neighborhood centers, they were given a paper tag and given a number. That number represented their family. There was not an individual number, and their names weren't actually usually associated to that. Sometimes in the records they did associate family names once they were in camp, but at this point, the same number would be put on their bags, the same paper tags, so they would try to keep them all together. Now, you will see there are folks that put like signs and symbols on their bags with the hopes that they wouldn't lose them, they'd be able to see them if they got put into some kind of storage area. And then here's another oral history. I still have nightmares. I have nightmares quite often trying to decide, what am I going to take? What am I going to do with everything? And what's going to happen to us? When we did this exhibit, we put out these little suitcases and said, what would you bring if you had about a week to decide? You didn't know where you were going. You didn't know what the temperature was going to be. You You didn't know how long you were going to be there. And it had to fit in something you could carry. It's hard to decide, trust me. I sat there and thought, because I thought, well, maybe it's the same stuff you think about when the house is on fire and you're going to run out of the house with it. It's not. So, there were 15 assembly centers, primarily, as you can see, in California, one in Oregon, one in Washington, and one in Arizona. Before I had a list, this is a long presentation, so I took it out, but I had list 3 assembly centers that sent the most people to Gila River, so you could get a sense of where these people came from. Primarily, it was the Bay Area, some from the Imperial Valley region, and then a lot of folks from LA. Now, the reason I bring this up is think about those different areas in 1940. Some of them are farmers, some of them are urbanites. They have almost nothing in common with each other, except that they're descendants of Japanese, ethnically, so to speak. When they get to the assembly centers were typically fairs or horse tracks, places that had buildings that weren't being used during the year. And so Santa Anita, if you've seen the horse racing movies that have been around or books, like Santa Anita housed over 13,000 people in horse stables. They basically briefly washed out the horse stables and then put a family group in each stable. The oral history is about the smell of urine is palpable when you read it. I can't imagine what it was like to live through. Sometimes it was vegetable, like they'd have a fair that was known for a vegetable, and that's where they would put them. Anywhere they could find large buildings that they could put lots of people in. And here is Turlock. Turlock sent almost all of the people that went to Turlock came to Gila. And you can see here's a young family coming in with those paper tags on. Their bags, those 2 bags each that they were allowed to bring, are then looked through, and then they go out to those buildings that sometimes were hastily created out of, in essence, flypaper and just, uprights. Very quickly built, if they weren't then the horse stables like I talked about. And then, after they had been there and the internment camps were built far enough that they could be sent to internment camps, they were loaded onto trains under armed guard. An image that is somewhat familiar, but not usually to what we think. But I will point out, every single place you look, there are soldiers standing next to them. And again, these people are willingly, they've not been like police showing up at their house and taking them. These are people that, I was told to report to this building, now we're sending you here, now we're going to this other place. So there were 10 incarceration camps. If you know anything about this subject or you research this subject, there are other camps. But what we're talking about is the main incarceration camps that created the system. There are names that have become familiar through books like, Snow Falling on Cedars, The Japanese Lover, and elsewhere. But Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Mendocca, Idaho, Tule Lake, California, Manzanar, California, Topaz, Utah, Grenada, Colorado, Rower, Arkansas, Jerome, and Rower ultimately sent people to Gila River. They closed. Poston, up on the river, and then Gila River itself. And so, what was the Gila River like? Trying to keep track of the time. Well, 10,290 of these folks came from those assembly centers. And you can see the countdown over here of where they came from. The reasons why you see some of these that I didn't list in the others gives you a sense that some were just transferred, because they were trying to connect families to other families. You could ask to be, if you were alone, like in Pomona, and you had family members that were going to another camp, you could request to be sent to that camp. Almost 3,000 were directly evacuated from their homes. So there were people that they were sort of picked up from their home and taken straight to the camp. 2,400 were transferred from other relocation centers like Brower and others in Arkansas. 234 were transferred from institutions. These might be hospitals, mental illness, old homes, etc. Also traveled via military escort. Now think about this. These are people that are so sick they can't leave the hospital, and yet they're still sent to the camp via armed guard. 662 were born in Gila itself, and in total, as best we can determine, because again, not all of the numbers always match up, but the agreed upon number that ultimately stayed part of the war in Gila were 16,655. Now, when we did our exhibit, we did a community outreach, and we asked to fold origami cranes. And we thought, well, we'll do 1,000 because with 1,000 you get a wish, and we thought that would be good. Shortly afterwards, a couple people on staff said, you know what, I think we should try for 16,000. I said, what if we don't make it, right? That's a lot of cranes. In about a month and a half, we had over 16,655 cranes. And we're going to give about 6,000 to the Gila River Indian site itself, as well as keeping 6,000 for our permanent display that we'll put up periodically on Remembrance Day about this. But it really is significant when you see 16,655 little paper cranes. You get a sense of how many people that really is. So, when they were sent to Gila River, they weren't told where they were going, first and foremost. They were just told they were getting ready to be sent to their internment camp. And I've been using the term internment camp and incarceration camp almost the same. Those of you that really like the meaning of words, internment camp, that's the thing that we often hear it known as, or if we've heard about the subject, we know internment. That is actually not the right word. You're actually a citizen of another country. You're interned during war. If you're a citizen, it's not internment, it's something else. During the time, because it hadn't quite got the stigma yet, in the newspaper you would hear about concentration camps, because that's exactly what they were doing. They were concentrating the people. But that word has gotten, because of the actions of Germany, it became a very heavy word. And so today, the politically agreed upon word is incarcerated, because they were held, by the law against their will, like you do if you're incarcerated. So they're referred to today as incarceration camps. But at the time it was called the Gila River Relocation Center, because the federal government was saying, well, we're relocating these Japanese because we don't want them to have the violence from their neighbors that no longer trust them, that think they may be spies. So we're going to relocate them for their safety. It wasn't totally true, but that's what they were being called at the time. They were loaded on trains, old trains, many of them without air conditioning. Blinds were pulled down, and they were sent off to where they didn't know. Some went to those other centers, others came to Gila River. They were transported in large groups, about 500 people a day. And they would arrive at a train drop-off point at Casa Grande, and then they would travel the rest of the way to the camp via either truck or bus. Now, at the time, they could only get about 40 to 50 at a time. So think about this. They started moving. The Gila River opened in June for the first people. Think about what June's like. And they kept moving people into Gila River through August into September. And remember, I said, unair-conditioned trains, shades drawn, on a siding in Casa Grande. Hot, and then you're waiting for these buses and trucks that can transport about 40 to 50 people at a time. And it would take almost all day to get those people into the camp, because when they got to camp, they were checked in and whatnot. And they arrived at what was known as the Gila River Relocation Center. Gila was divided into two separate camps. There was actually two camps that made up Gila River. Butte Camp, because it was by a butte, and Canal Camp, because it was by the canal. Overall, you can sort of see here in this drawing, this black line is the boundaries of the camp. Mostly to the north and to the east it was surrounded by barbed wire. To the south, they did not, because it was so far that they didn't actually think people would go that way. But there were armed guards that did patrol the entire thing. And most of these people, the first time they knew they were in the Arizona desert was when they got off the train at Casa Grande. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they were being sent to interior camps somewhere in the United States. So here's Canal Camp. You can see the barracks headed off into the distance there. And Butte Camp. If you're really familiar with the Butte, you might be able to even see where that is, because you can actually see that Butte from I-10 pretty easily. Camp layout was pretty standard, whether it was Canal Camp or Butte Camp or even Manzanar, Hart Mountain. They were organized this way. They were based off of military barracks, was the original idea, because they needed to build them quickly and they knew how to build military barracks. And so they were 10 to 12 barracks with a communal mess hall, bath, shower facilities, restroom, laundry, and recreational hall. Now, let's talk about that for a second. One of the things about Japanese culture that we probably are familiar with was they value their privacy greatly. And intentional or not, what this was an attack on that sensibility, because now you were not eating as a family group, you were eating communally. You were showering with other people that are not part of your family. You're even going to the bathroom with other people that aren't part of your family. There's a loss of privacy. Believe it or not, the buildings that are in Gila River were a little bit better than the average camp, because they knew that they were going to get this intense heat. So they actually had 2 roofs to try to buffer that intense sun. But they were basically made of white plasterboard with a double roof. And they were about 20 to 120 feet long and divided into 4 to 6 rooms. A family group got 1 room. Didn't matter whether you had 2 people or you had 10 people. You got 1 room. So they were slightly different sizes. That's why I said it was 4 to 6 rooms in those barracks. If you were just a married couple, you'd get a really small room and one that had 6 in it. If not, you'd get a slightly bigger one. Here's a hand-drawn map by a former internee showing my favorite. We live here. He was a child at the time and had very fond memories. But you can when you look at the legend, you can see some areas were left open to be recreation areas. Others were schools and other things, which we'll get to in a second. So what was life like in the camp? Well, the camp opened officially in, that's wrong, June 20th, sorry, typo, oops. June 20th, but many parts were still unfinished. The floors themselves were made out of green wood. And so, as you can imagine, as it dried out during that summer, they warped. And what that left was ginormous cracks where when the wind blew, lots of dust came in. And so there's a lot of talk from Gila River people about trying to keep the dust out. There was an insufficient number of barracks, and so that were finished, but they kept sending people. So it led to overcrowding almost immediately. And also the water and sewer system was not complete and only ran part of the day. So very quickly this led to terrible odor, mosquitoes, and ultimately disease. And actually the raw sewage just pumped directly into an area that was a pit. So it smelled no matter what, but that's the way the system was going to work. Ultimately, they did create a newspaper, and this is a drawing from the very first newspaper. It's Butte Camp, you can tell from the water tower. And these are open trenches because the trenches weren't even closed because they were still working on the sewer system and the water system. And so it's hard to see, but there's a little guy walking across the 2x4 to go get some water because there were no water in that camp area. You'll also see it calls it Rivers, Arizona. The entire camp, when it was created as a postal area, was called Rivers. And ultimately, when the camp was full, it was the 4th largest city in Arizona. Something to think about. So, we have a quote again. Well, there wasn't much there until we got all this recreation center and school and everything put up. We just made the best we could. All we looked forward to was the 3 times we went over to the mess hall to eat. No laughs. And then gradually the canteens were open, and then the school, so it was a gradual thing. They really weren't prepared for us. Hospitals weren't set up. They weren't finished for a couple months later, until a couple months later. Maybe it was longer than that. So, you know, the government really wasn't prepared. They were seeking to move these folks in as quick as they could. Not ready. Here's another one. And we drove in and went to the administrative building, and they tell us exactly where we're going to go and everything. They had us all. We were there into 23. That's block 23, building number 7, room B. That's the address, which is block 23, the 7th building. And there were 4 rooms. And we were the 2nd room. And then the 4th room was always a couple, or it's a really small one. And so we finally got our place. And at the time we said, oh gosh, it's just a straw bed with a pot-bellied stove. Just a bed. And I thought, my gosh, all of us are sleeping in there. So we started bringing out our sheets to separate the space a little bit. So yeah, they were given a room. They were sometimes given cot, at least a mattress. The mattress was usually a straw mattress. Sometimes they created the mattress themselves. And they were given a form to heat themselves. Here is one of those barracks from Gila River. Actual barrack. You can see the double roof. You can see the white pasteboard. You can see you could alter it if you could find the wood. So several of these folks were had a lot of ingenuity. These folks found some extra wood and built little shade structures over the window to try to make it a little cooler. There's other stories about folks that pulled up the floorboards and dug a shallow pit and tried to put as much water in there as they could, so they created like a swamp cooler for their entire room to stay a little cool during the summer. Now, this photo is not from Gila, but it is very representative of what the Gila rooms would look like. They were just the wood, and there's the cots. They were often very close to each other. The other thing, those walls that divided this space didn't go all the way to the ceiling. They went up far enough, but it didn't go to the ceiling. And so let's think about that privacy issue again. Suddenly, your room is no longer private from even the room next door. So whatever's going on over there, you can hear and they can hear in reverse. And again, very difficult. But you increasingly started to see people trying to find extra wood, scrap wood that was left over for construction, and they'd build tables, chairs, shelves for comfort. And you can see this guy's using the interior bracing as a shelf for some of the stuff he brought. Cafeteria style dining, as I said, not private at all. And it was military style food. So this was not the kind of food that Japanese folks were used to eating, which, as you can imagine, the food didn't change very often. It wasn't food they were used to. And so again, it just kind of get that reminder that you weren't at home anymore. You were someplace different. So, now we get into these more challenging areas. I'm going to try to move quickly because I want to leave time for some questions. They realized that some of these people were going to be loyal, and they needed to find a way to figure out who was loyal and who wasn't. And so the way they did that was they created a questionnaire. And they said, well, we'll just answer this. If they answer these questions properly, we'll say they're loyal, and then we'll create a system that they can then eventually move into the interior. They're not allowed to go back to the coast because we don't want them to be a risk. But if they're found loyal through this survey, they can be entered into. And all of the questions were fairly straightforward except the last two, 27 and 28. 27 was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? So in essence, are you willing to fight if we send you to Japan? 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack from foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any formal allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor and any other foreign government, power, or organization? Okay. If you're loyal, you can say, well, of course we'll say yes to both of those. Yes, I'll fight if you send me, and I will forswear any allegiance to Japan. Let's go back to that point when I said about the immigration law that prevented you as a path to citizenship. If you were not a citizen and you forswear all allegiance to other countries, you just became a man without a country, or a person without a country. Because you can't become a citizen of the United States, but you're swearing your entire allegiance to the other country that you still may be a citizen of. So you literally become a non-political person with no protection whatsoever. When this happened, there were several young Japanese Americans, many of them citizens, that refused to answer yes to either of them because it affected their grandparents or their parents. And they said, well, I'm not going to say yes because my parents can't say yes to this. And this led to this creation of what was called a no-no boy. There's been some plays and some books written about the no-no boys, but these are young men that said no, and they were then arrested in the incarceration camp and sent to a different incarceration camp called Tule Lake. And it became known as the Tule Lake segregation camp because they were going to put all the unloyal Japanese in that camp in California. So a good portion, I want to say like 3,000 people from Gila River were sent to Tule Lake. Meanwhile, they tried to create a sense of normalcy while they were in the camp. So there's this concept in Japanese culture, gaman, where you try to live with patience and enduring things with patience and dignity, despite how unbelievable it seems. And that's what you would see with these people as they created new social, community organizations, trying to find new places, new ways to get along. And here's a quote where this basically says, well, once you lived in a block, you sort of became your neighborhood. You just had to get to know them because you were going to spend time with them in the dining hall and everything. So what did they do? They tried to create jobs so that they could feel like they were normal. So there were agricultural fields. The agricultural fields of Gila were so productive that they helped feed many of the other camps throughout the system, and including some of those agricultural products were even sold to local communities. They were so, and here they began growing vegetables that they were used to, root vegetables that were more like their food, so they could get a little bit more sense of normalcy. They ran a dairy farm, a very successful dairy farm that, again, which the materials were sent out to camps and other communities throughout the war. Created churches. This one happens to be a Buddhist church, but there were, even though people thought they were not Christian, there were Catholic churches, there were Presbyterian churches, there were Methodist churches that were also created because some of them were all of those religions. Schools were created, all the way from kindergarten up to high school. We actually, I didn't put any pictures in here. We actually have 2 yearbooks from 2 different graduating classes from Butte High School. Recreation centers. Here you see men playing a game called Go. It's somewhat similar to Othello, but it's different. It's a strategy game. But they play cards, they play traditional games as well. They created that newspaper that I talked about. This newspaper talked about people that were leaving, people that were coming, things they heard, what was going on. They even created festivals. There were football teams, baseball teams, a sumo wrestling ring. And yes, indeed, they worked for the war. They had several different efforts that they put into the war. The biggest, the most photographed was this model ship factory where they were building models of our enemy ships so that the Navy men could see them and recognize them on the horizon. They were building camouflage nets for our Navy and land forces as well. And they had a fall festival multiple times. You can see this is the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League. This is one of the groups that encouraged Japanese Americans to go into camp because it would show the loyalty that we had to our country if we didn't protest, just go into the camps. And even dances, proms, the whole thing. You wouldn't recognize it. This could have gone on in any school if you didn't notice that the structure's a little different than what most schools look like. And baseball. I'd be remiss to not talk about baseball in the camp because baseball was huge when we talk about a sense of normalcy. This man by the name of Kenichi Zenomura was a very famous pro baseball player who created Japanese professional baseball leagues in California. He's considered the father of Japanese baseball in California. He was sent to Gila River, and he was very depressed when he first got there. He didn't even want to open up his suitcase at first, but after just a few weeks, him and his sons began walking over in the area that was still open next to the camp and began leveling a surface to potentially play some baseball. Soon, other folks were assisting, going out there and helping them. And then ultimately they borrowed some wire and some post from the fence, and they created a backdrop. They created dugouts, and indeed began a series of baseball leagues that would play anybody and everybody, including the state baseball champs from Tucson in a famous game in '45. And also they would travel to other camps. Their all-star team would travel. Here you can see that stadium. A family member had snuck in a camera. This is the only photograph we have. This sat thousands of people. If you look, there are bleachers, sunken dugouts. There's a fence for home run. It's a dirt infield and a grass outfield. I mean, this is amazing. And some very good baseball that was played. This is actually the all-star team. This photograph is signed by every single member of the team. Kenichi Zinamura is right there in the center. His son is in this, and we did a dedication of a kiosk in Chandler to this, and his son came out for the dedication. It's pretty wonderful. There's a quote here from one of the players. "It was demeaning and humiliating to be incarcerated in your own country. Without baseball, camp life would have been miserable." Ultimately, some of these baseball players went on to continue to play professional ball or serve as scouts for the Major League Baseball teams. It's kind of ironic that America's game was what they sought for normalcy. And there was a few ways you could leave camp before the end of the war. They realized there were going to be these loyal Japanese, and we had to be able to give them the opportunity to find a way out. And so usually this meant starting from scratch, because you were not going to go back to California or Oregon or Washington, wherever you're from. You were going to have to create a new sense of community, find a place, and you had to find someone that was willing to sponsor you. So this was not a quick process. You had to find a place that was willing to accept you, find someone there who was willing to sponsor you, and then create the system and then get the authority to leave. Now, they were given travel visas, sort of, to travel, but they could only travel between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And so think about 1940, without the modern highway system, you'd have to figure out where you were going, because you could only travel to 5 o'clock, because if you were there out after 5 o'clock, you were arrested. So your papers only allowed you to travel. Ultimately, 14,000 of those 16,655 people left the relocation and chose to resettle in 35 different states from where they came. One way is to go to college. This is a young lady, Yanako, going to Buffalo, University of Buffalo. This is Fred Taguri. He got a job in a grocery run by another Japanese American in Chicago. And military service was another way to go. You could join the military, and actually there were 487 Japanese Americans who joined the military. Of these, 77 were casualties, with 16 killed and 66 wounded and 1 missing in action. So think about this. This is your country incarcerating you, taking away your home, your place of business, and you choose to go fight for them. Here's a photo of Kazuo Komodo. Received a Purple Heart and came back to visit his brother in Gila River to show off his Purple Heart. This was considered a wonderful PR photo at the time. Now it has a little bit more irony to it. And we have this in our collection. This is a postcard from a man by the name of Henry Kondo. He was a student at USC. He wrote a letter to the bookstore. You don't have the letter did not survive. The letter probably was letting him know that he was not going to be coming to get his books for the rest of the year. Meantime, he joins the military, goes to Italy, and dies in a famous battle called the Lost Texas Battalion, where they rescued some Texas soldiers that were pinned down in Italy. He lost his life at that battle. But we have this envelope that he sent, and you can see he lived in Block 58, Building 1, Room C. So they closed the camps shortly after being elected to his 4th term in 1944. FDR signed Public Proclamation 21, which basically ended the executive order saying we didn't need to incarcerate these people anymore. There were almost 10,000 people still in Gila that stayed there because many of them didn't know where to go. So they stayed in Gila almost to the end, past the war, into 45. In the last days of the camp, there were still people there, and that was November 10th, 1945. The war had been over almost 3 months by that point. So it's something to think about. They were forced to start over. They weren't, even if they'd stayed in the camp the entire time and they were allowed to go back to California, some of their neighbors were still very suspicious of them because they were like, well, our country wouldn't have incarcerated you for no reason. There must have been a reason you were incarcerated. And some of them, they had family members who had died in the war and were very bitter against Japanese, even though these people probably were Japanese Americans. You had to find jobs, you had to find a place to live, you had to find some of them had stuff that had been saved for them, some of them had not. There's a great story out there by a man who had a very large library. He paid someone to store it, and every month he sent payments. He got home, and the books had never been stored. He'd been sending home money for the rent, and they were gone. A formal apology, the rescinding of that and saying we were wrong, didn't happen until 1988 when George Herbert Walker Bush signed an apology, and we did give a small monetary stipend to the descendants of these folks. I say small because, again, often this was a lost business, a lost home, a lost community. And so the final thought here is really a thought about what fear can do to us. Fear, whether it's justified or not, can oftentimes lead us to make decisions that if we actually sat down and spent some time with it, we probably might not make. But in this situation, over 120,000, over 110,000 people were incarcerated. Not for any reason, not for any illicit act, not for any sabotage. There was not a single bit of sabotage done by a Japanese American for the Empire of Japan. There were 10 episodes of sabotage for the Japanese in the United States. Every single one of them was done by what we would call an Anglo. And when we were doing this talk with a member of the modern day Japanese American Citizens League, he said, well, it's not a very good idea to have a spy that looks like the enemy. It's better to have a spy that looks like you. That being said, really, these people were incarcerated for no other reason than they looked like the enemy. Many of them citizens, and it's one of these things that as difficult as it is, it's something to have a conversation about now and forever when we talk about, do we put people on a list? Do we allow people in? Do we not allow them in? Who do we allow? Who's an American? That's why we put the title Un-American, because the question is, which is more un-American? Looking like the enemy or incarcerating someone that isn't really your enemy? So, with that, I'll say thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly where this was. Can you tell me? In this
Yeah,
area?
so if you are driving south on the I-10 from Chandler, the camp would be off on your left on the I-10. Now I say that, and I will give you a strong and incredibly strong warning. This is a national park site, except there's no marker, there is no site to go see. It is on tribal lands. They consider this area sacred, not only for their own people, but this other relationship that they now have with the Japanese Americans. And so you can apply to go out to the site. It's rather lengthy. You have to go through the governor's office. So just know that it's off to the west, but I don't go out there. And
Are there still remnants of the,
there are a little bit of foundations. There is a surround. So like many communities during World War II, they put up a billboard sign for all the people that were serving in the military. And so the wooden sign is gone, but the cement barrier that held the sign is still there. Every Remembrance Day, February 29th, the local JACL from Phoenix goes out and cleans up the site and helps. And they often have a ceremony there. But there are no buildings left over. After the war, many of those buildings were sold. And if you go into Chandler, there are probably about 35 buildings that are still around today that are former barracks that, if you remember, after the war, there was struggle with construction projects. So people would buy these, move them up, and then convert them. The other thing that's kind of interesting is the entire south half of Chandler, south of, I would say probably Fry Road, that water system is the water system from Gila, because the city bought that water system and installed it. So the hydrants, and a lot of it's been changed out since then, but that's what created the water system. So when I say Chandler was heavily affected by this, they were, that like later on, part of our city is still remnants of it. Also, many of these folks had jobs that they could leave the camp for, and they would go pick cotton in Chandler and elsewhere. So many of them had jobs out of the camp as well, but they still had to go back.
The kiosk on Casablanca, just west of I-10.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we built a kiosk in Chandler off of McClintock. It's in Nozomi Park, and it's a 5-sided kiosk because we wanted it. First of all, the number 4 is an unlucky number in Japanese culture, so we didn't want to do 4. So we picked 5 because if you roughly think about the home plate, it's a 5-sided item. So we put that there in between 2 baseball fields, and we talk about this history. You can go see it anytime. It's open to the public. Yes, sir.
I have heard there is a big concrete circle up on the butte out there. Was that where the water tank sat, or is that something else?
Yes, the water tower sat up on the butte, yes. They had, actually, believe it or not, I didn't put it in the talk, but Eleanor Roosevelt visited the camp because she was very upset about what was going on. She actually encouraged her husband to close the camps earlier than he did, and she made a trip out to Gila, and there are photographs of her over by the butte talking to people in the camp and everything. So yes, the water tower was on the top of the butte. Questions? Yes?
I'm curious, was there no ACLU, or did the Supreme Court,
It was a time of war.
yeah.
And
the real war?
and there were people that were, and again, I began the beginning part of the talk because the fear was real,
Yeah.
and you can't look back with modern sensibilities and say that fear wasn't real.
Well,
But the challenging issue was there was a court case where a member of the camps tried to go to the Supreme Court and say this is not justified. He lost. It was retried in the 70s, and he was found proper. And that's when the first conversations about should we do something as a country started to change. But it was in the 70s because immediately after the war, especially the older generations did not want to talk about what happened to them. They wanted to go back and just be normal and say, look, we were loyal back then, we're loyal now, we don't need to talk about what happened. Because they
You
thought
know,
it was
I
terrible.
from another point of view, I asked my mother what, cause she was, 20, something like that. How did people feel? How did the other citizens like her feel when this happened? And she said, well, we thought it was terrible because these were teachers, these were people from stores that we knew. And she said, however, that was, and this I thought was so interesting, that was a different time in this country. And we thought if the government said it was necessary, that was true. That's what we believe.
And that's absolutely true. That's what I'm saying. There's lots of views to this, and that's why it's challenging because there's really no good guy and bad guy in this story. It's just a place where suddenly many of those values that we have are not truly totally held up. And so that's where we talk about how we learn from history, not because it's going to happen again, but what do we learn from it? Yes, sir.
Any idea how many people may have gone back to Japan after this? And got
A number,
disgusted?
yes. There's actually there's a list of we had it on the wall when the exhibit was open at the museum. We had a list of all the people, and then you could find out what happened. Over 1,000 people from Gila River alone returned. Many of them citizens, renounced their citizenship and went back to what, if we remember, is a country that had 2 atomic bombs dropped on it. And so think about that for a minute. You had people in December of '45 choosing to go back to Japan because they felt that this country was not welcoming them anymore.
I know some camps had Boy Scout troops. Did Gila River have a?
Yep, there was Boy Scout troops. There were church groups. There was anything and everything. When you read the newspaper, that little newspaper, it's shocking because there are comments like this shouldn't really be happening. But then there's the Boy Scout troops over here doing this, and the Knights of Columbus are over here doing that, and it's surprising. Despite this, that sense of we must go on, we must remain, every day. Yeah. One last question.
Can you describe the contact between the Gila River Indian community and the Japanese? Was there much contact?
No. And actually, the Gila River Indian Nation subsequently protested the choice of setting this camp on their land. This is in part because when you hear members of the tribe talk about it, ones that were still around, is they remember seeing the electricity go on at the camp and saying, wait a minute, we don't have electricity in our communities, and yet these people you've arrested and you're holding them because they're disloyal and they have electricity, they have running water, we don't. And so one of the things that we are in the process of doing is trying to work with the governor's office to try to tell the story from the opposite side as well, where we tell what the Native Americans and how they felt. When we did our dedication of Nozomi, a member of the governor's office came and spoke and said, the destiny of our 2 people were forever tied together by this incident. Both of us a proud people, but forever marked by this incident. So that's partially why they view those camps as sacred as well, because it's something that affected not only them, but the Japanese Americans.
Awesome.
All right, well, thank you very much.